In the heart of Havana, the streets erupted with a sound that carried far beyond the neighborhoods of the Cuban capital. It was not gunfire. It was not sirens. It was the sharp metallic rhythm of pots and pans. Ordinary citizens stood on balconies, crowded into narrow streets, and beat kitchenware together in protest. This form of defiance, known across Latin America as the cacerolazo, echoed through the city as people expressed their anger over endless power outages and decades of communist rule. The immediate trigger came on the afternoon of March 4th. A massive blackout swept across western Cuba after a serious malfunction at one of the country's most important power facilities, the Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant. According to Cuba's National Electric Union, a boiler leak forced the plant offline, triggering a cascading failure that shut down large portions of the national power grid. Within hours, millions of Cubans were left in darkness. Entire neighborhoods plunged into silence. Traffic lights failed. Elevators froze between floors. Mobile networks flickered and collapsed. Reports from residents described piles of trash accumulating along the streets, shops shuttered early, and internet access disappearing across wide areas of the island. Havana, usually vibrant with music and movement, suddenly felt like a city holding its breath. And when a city falls into darkness long enough, frustration begins to boil. That is exactly what happened. For many Cubans, this was not just another blackout. It felt like the latest chapter in a much deeper crisis that has been unfolding for years. Since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the country has endured hardship, embargoes, and economic struggles. But many observers say the island has never appeared closer to systemic collapse than it does today. By the early hours of March 5th, Cuba's Ministry of Energy announced that the national grid had been reconnected. Technically, the lights came back. But stability did not. Power across the island remains fragile, unpredictable, and prone to sudden failure. If you listen closely to the voices coming from Havana, you can hear something deeper than anger. There is exhaustion, decades of promises, decades of shortages, and now a power system that fails again and again. At some point, people stop believing that tomorrow will be better. And that point may already have arrived. In recent years, the Cuban grid has suffered frequent and severe outages. During peak electricity demand, more than half of the country has often lost power at the same time. The causes are well known: fuel shortages, aging infrastructure, and power plants that have long exceeded their designed operational lifespan. The situation has deteriorated steadily. By the end of 2024, Cuba had already experienced 3 nationwide blackouts. Then, on the evening of March 14, 2025, another widespread outage struck, affecting Havana and multiple provinces simultaneously. Each blackout pushed public frustration a little further. Each outage chipped away at the government's credibility. Major protests erupted in 2021, again in 2022, and once more in 2024, all sparked by widespread power failures and economic hardship. These demonstrations were some of the largest the island had seen in decades. Watching these scenes unfold, one thing becomes clear. When electricity disappears, the darkness exposes more than broken infrastructure. It reveals the cracks in an entire political system. And the energy crisis gripping Cuba is not simply domestic. It is deeply tied to international geopolitics. For years, Cuba has relied heavily on oil shipments from Venezuela to keep its power plants running. Venezuelan crude has been the lifeline of the Cuban energy system. But that supply chain has now become dangerously unstable. In December last year, the United States began blocking oil tankers traveling to and from Venezuela. Then, in early July 2025, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was captured by United States forces in Caracas. The event sent shockwaves through the region and effectively cut off Venezuela's oil support for Cuba. The consequences for Havana were immediate and severe. Without Venezuelan fuel, Cuba's already fragile energy network began to collapse under pressure. Power plants slowed. Fuel reserves dwindled. Blackouts multiplied. At the same time, Washington escalated pressure even further. The Trump administration imposed an oil blockade on Cuba, warning that any trade partners continuing to support the island's fuel supply could face tariff penalties from the United States. It was a direct message. Economic isolation would intensify unless political change occurred. And that raises a question that few people in Havana can ignore anymore. Is the Cuban government facing an energy crisis, or the opening phase of a geopolitical showdown? If you think about it, the timing is impossible to ignore. Venezuela destabilized. Oil shipments cut off. Blackouts spreading across Cuba. And suddenly Washington begins talking openly about the island's political future. The stage, it seems, is being set. If you're watching this story unfold, share your thoughts below. Do you believe Cuba is approaching a historic turning point? And if so, what might happen next? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this unfolding geopolitical story. Cuba's energy crisis did not appear overnight. It has been building quietly for years, hidden behind temporary fixes and emergency fuel shipments. But once Venezuela's support began to crumble, the fragile structure holding Cuba's power system together started to fall apart piece by piece. For decades, Venezuela acted as Cuba's primary energy lifeline. Under a close ideological alliance between the two socialist governments, Caracas shipped large volumes of crude oil to the island. In exchange, Cuba sent doctors, intelligence advisors, and technical specialists to Venezuela. It was a partnership built on politics as much as economics. But when Venezuela's internal instability deepened, that arrangement began to weaken. Production in Venezuela dropped dramatically. Political tensions rose, and international pressure mounted. Then came the decisive moment. In early July 2025, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was captured by United States forces during an operation in Caracas. The event instantly changed the balance of power across Latin America. With Maduro removed, the long-standing oil relationship between Venezuela and Cuba was effectively severed. Almost immediately, Venezuela's new interim leadership began cooperating closely with Washington. The interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, took control of the government under heavy international supervision. One of the first actions of the transitional administration was the release of political prisoners. At the same time, negotiations began with the United States regarding oil exports and energy policy. From Washington's perspective, this shift opened a major strategic opportunity. President Donald Trump announced that the United States had officially recognized the new Venezuelan government. Soon afterward, an agreement involving Venezuelan gold reserves was reached between the two countries. At the same time, the United States Treasury revealed plans to gradually allow oil shipments to resume toward Cuba under specific conditions. But the message behind those policies was unmistakable. Energy would now become leverage. Trump had already made his priorities clear long before these events unfolded. He had repeatedly stated that after dealing with Iran, the next geopolitical focus would be Cuba. For decades, the island had remained one of the last communist governments in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Washington appeared determined to change that equation. Listening to these developments, you start to sense that this is not just about electricity or fuel shortages anymore. This is a strategic pressure campaign unfolding in real time. And the signals from Washington have become increasingly direct. In late January, Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly expressed support for regime change in Cuba. Speaking openly about the issue, Rubio declared that there was no doubt it would greatly benefit the United States if Cuba were no longer governed by what he described as an autocratic regime. Statements like that are rarely made casually in international politics. Meanwhile, the Cuban government itself has begun to show signs of cautious flexibility. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel recently indicated that Havana may be willing to reopen dialogue with the United States. That alone is a remarkable shift considering the decades of hostility between the two countries. President Trump soon assigned Rubio to oversee Cuban affairs, signaling that Washington intended to move forward with a focused strategy toward the island. On March 5th, speaking from the White House, Trump made another striking remark. He stated that it was only a matter of time before Cubans living abroad would return to their homeland. 2 days later, on March 7th, during the Shield of the Americas summit in Miami, Trump again addressed the issue directly. Standing before regional leaders, he declared that communist Cuba was approaching its end and that negotiations with the Cuban government were already underway. Those words were heard far beyond Miami. For many analysts, the statement suggested that Washington might be preparing what some describe as a soft transition in Cuba, not an invasion, not a sudden collapse, but a gradual shift in political control, encouraged through economic pressure and diplomatic maneuvering. And this is where the situation becomes even more complex. Around the same time, an overseas Chinese dissident released a video showing Cubans protesting the massive power outage. The dissident offered a striking interpretation of events. First Venezuela, then Iran, now Cuba, and perhaps next, China. Whether that prediction proves accurate remains to be seen. But one thing is undeniable. The crisis unfolding in Cuba is no longer just a regional story. It is becoming part of a much larger geopolitical struggle. Because Cuba is not standing alone. Behind Havana stands another powerful partner with global ambitions. And that partner is Beijing. If the United States is increasing pressure on Cuba today, it may not be solely about the island itself. It may also be about something far bigger, a growing strategic rivalry between Washington and the Chinese Communist Party. That rivalry has quietly been building in Cuba for decades. And the deeper you look into the relationship between Cuba and China, the more you begin to understand why Washington is paying such close attention. So, the real question now becomes this: how deeply has China embedded itself inside Cuba's political, economic, and intelligence systems? Because the answer to that question could reshape the entire balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. Before we dive into that next layer of the story, tell me what you think. Is Cuba simply experiencing an internal crisis? Or are we witnessing the opening moves of a much larger global confrontation? Leave your thoughts in the comments, like this video if you're following the story, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. The geopolitical picture is about to become even more intense. To fully understand the crisis unfolding in Cuba today, we have to look beyond the blackouts, beyond the protests, and beyond the immediate political pressure coming from Washington. Because behind the Cuban government stands one of the most powerful geopolitical players in the world today, the Chinese Communist Party. The relationship between Beijing and Havana is not new. In fact, it is one of the longest-standing socialist alliances still active in the modern world. Both governments frequently refer to each other as good friends and good brothers. And that friendship stretches across politics, ideology, trade, military cooperation, and intelligence operations. The roots of this relationship go back more than half a century. On September 28, 1960, Cuba became the first Latin American country to establish official diplomatic relations with Communist China. At that time, the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro's revolutionary government shared strong ideological alignment and a common hostility toward the United States. After Castro seized power in 1959, Cuba quickly faced economic isolation due to the American embargo. Many of the regime's domestic economic experiments failed, leaving the island heavily dependent on foreign support. That support came primarily from the Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, Moscow was providing approximately $4 billion United States dollars each year to sustain the Cuban economy. The Soviet subsidies kept the island afloat, providing oil, food, and financial assistance to maintain the socialist system. Meanwhile, China itself was struggling through its own challenges. The Chinese Communist Party was consolidating control after years of political upheaval, dealing with tensions in the Korean Peninsula, managing the existence of the Republic of China in Taiwan, and navigating a fragile domestic economy. Then the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically. The Sino-Soviet split during the 1960s and 1970s created friction between Cuba and China. Havana remained closely aligned with Moscow, while Beijing moved in its own strategic direction. For a period of time, relations between Cuba and China cooled significantly. But history has a way of bringing old allies back together. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba suddenly lost the financial lifeline that had sustained its economy for decades. The island entered what became known as the Special Period, a severe economic crisis marked by shortages, rationing, and dramatic declines in living standards. And at that moment, China began stepping in. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Beijing gradually expanded its economic and diplomatic engagement with Havana. The partnership deepened further under Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who has maintained close relations with Cuba as one of the few remaining communist allies in the world. When you look at the global map of communist governments today, the list is very short, and that makes Cuba extremely valuable to Beijing. But in recent years, the relationship has evolved beyond ideological solidarity. Since 2022, China and Cuba have repeatedly promoted the concept of a China-Cuba community of shared destiny. It is a phrase that signals not only political friendship but also long-term strategic integration. In September 2025, the leaders of both countries met and issued a joint statement reinforcing this partnership. Havana publicly supported Beijing on several controversial international issues, including Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, human rights disputes, and the status of Taiwan. In return, China has provided Cuba with technological and economic support that reaches deep into the island's infrastructure. Chinese technology companies such as Huawei, ZTE, and TP-Link have played a major role in building Cuba's telecommunications network. These systems form the backbone of the country's internet and mobile communication services. But technology can serve more than one purpose. During the massive protests that erupted in Cuba in 2021, the government used surveillance tools and telecommunications infrastructure built with Chinese technology to shut down internet access across the island. Protesters suddenly lost their ability to communicate, organize, or share information with the outside world. Watching that unfold, it became clear that the partnership between Beijing and Havana was not just about trade or development. It was also about control, and that is where the geopolitical stakes begin to rise. China has become one of Cuba's three largest trading partners and the island's largest source of imports. Chinese investments support multiple sectors, including infrastructure development, petrochemical facilities, transportation projects, and industrial modernization. China also purchases Cuban resources such as zinc and nickel, two materials that are increasingly important in the global energy transition. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of the relationship lies within China's Belt and Road Initiative. In November 2018, Cuba officially joined Beijing's global infrastructure program. The Belt and Road Initiative promises massive development projects across the world, but critics argue that it often creates long-term debt dependency. And Cuba may be a textbook example. Chinese loans and construction projects have expanded rapidly on the island, yet the exact financial details remain largely undisclosed by Cuban officials. Analysts in Washington have repeatedly warned that these arrangements could eventually allow Beijing to gain strategic leverage over Cuban infrastructure and national assets. Some United States think tanks have even described Cuba as a cautionary case study of Belt and Road influence in the Western Hemisphere. If those concerns prove accurate, the implications are enormous. Because the deeper China becomes embedded in Cuba's economy, the harder it becomes for Havana to operate independently. At this point, the relationship between the two governments is no longer simply diplomatic. It has evolved into something far more strategic. And once intelligence cooperation enters the equation, the stakes grow even higher. Because behind the economic partnerships and technology projects, a quiet intelligence network has been expanding across the island. One that sits just 145 kilometers from the coastline of the United States. Think about that distance for a moment. 145 kilometers is closer than many people realize. From Cuba, signals can reach deep into the southeastern United States, which raises a chilling question. What exactly is China building inside Cuba? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe China's involvement in Cuba is purely economic, or does it represent something far more strategic? Like the video if you're following this story, and subscribe because the final part will reveal how this alliance could reshape the entire balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. If the economic partnership between Beijing and Havana raised eyebrows in Washington, the military and intelligence cooperation between the two governments has triggered something far more serious alarm. The turning point began after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When Moscow withdrew its financial support from Cuba in the early 1990s, the island was left struggling to maintain many of the strategic facilities that had once been funded by Soviet resources. Among those facilities were several large signal intelligence stations that had been used to monitor communications across the United States. And this is where China saw an opportunity. In 1999, China and Cuba signed agreements allowing Beijing to help operate and modernize several of these former Soviet listening stations. In exchange, Chinese intelligence gained access to locations that had once been some of the most sensitive surveillance points in the Western Hemisphere. One of the most well-known sites is the Bajikal Station, located south of Havana. During the Cold War, it was one of the Soviet Union's most important intelligence facilities for monitoring American military communications. Today, that station has taken on new life. Around 2019, satellite imagery showed significant upgrades being carried out at the site. Analysts observed new structures, expanded antenna systems, and modernization of electronic infrastructure. And the upgrades did not stop there. In recent years, China has invested approximately $8 billion into Cuban infrastructure projects, including telecommunications networks and technology systems developed by companies such as Huawei and ZTE. But hidden within these investments, intelligence analysts believe a much broader surveillance architecture has been quietly taking shape. Satellite images from 2024 and 2025 revealed at least 4 major suspected Chinese intelligence facilities operating across Cuba. These sites appear to be undergoing continuous expansion and technological upgrades. The largest and most active facility, Bajikal, added a massive circular antenna array in 2025. Analysts estimate that such an array could monitor signals across thousands of kilometers, reaching far beyond the island itself. Additional sites have been identified near locations such as Wajay, Calabazar, and El Salao. One location in particular has drawn special attention from United States defense officials. El Salao sits dangerously close to the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, one of America's most strategically sensitive military installations in the region. From these locations, intelligence systems could potentially monitor American military bases throughout the southeastern United States. Facilities such as MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, the Kings Bay Submarine Base in Georgia, and even aerospace launch sites along the Atlantic coast could fall within range of signal interception. When analysts map out the coverage area of these stations, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. Cuba is not simply an island anymore. It is becoming an intelligence platform. In June 2023, the Wall Street Journal revealed an agreement between China and Cuba to establish additional electronic eavesdropping facilities on the island. Shortly after the report surfaced, officials within the White House confirmed that Chinese intelligence operations in Cuba had already been active for several years. United States Southern Command, along with several major policy institutes in Washington, has repeatedly warned Congress about the implications. Their assessment is blunt. Cuba may now represent China's most important intelligence outpost anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and it sits just 145 kilometers from the American mainland. For many strategists, the situation has an uncomfortable historical echo. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union attempted to place nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis and bringing the world dangerously close to nuclear war. Today, the circumstances are different, but the strategic logic feels strangely familiar. If tensions were ever to escalate into a conflict over Taiwan, some analysts believe China could attempt to use Cuba as a pressure point against the United States. Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China, has warned that in a future global conflict, China might attempt to deploy nuclear-capable missile systems in Cuba. Such weapons could serve as a strategic deterrent, discouraging other nations from supporting Taiwan during a military confrontation in the Taiwan Strait. Even if such deployments never occur, the intelligence capabilities alone could shift the balance of power. Over the past decade, China has launched approximately 300 advanced satellites designed to collect information about global economic activity, military movements, and communication systems. When combined with ground-based facilities such as those in Cuba, the result is a growing worldwide intelligence network. In many ways, Cuba could serve as a hub within that network, and Washington is beginning to respond. During the previous administration of President Joe Biden, several lawmakers warned about the growing Chinese presence in the Caribbean. One of the most outspoken voices was Congressman Matt Gaetz from Florida, who argued that China was turning Cuba into what he described as a stationary aircraft carrier positioned directly off the American coastline. He even suggested that the United States should consider using military force to destroy Chinese intelligence installations on the island. At the time, no major action followed. But the strategic environment has changed. China's influence across Latin America has expanded dramatically during the past 2 decades. Trade between China and countries such as Brazil and Peru now exceeds $500 billion United States dollars. More than 20 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have joined Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Through these projects, Chinese companies have secured control or influence over major infrastructure assets, including ports, logistics hubs, and transportation corridors. And ports matter. Today, Chinese companies own or operate approximately 40 seaports across Latin America. In Peru, China recently constructed one of the deepest port facilities in the region, raising concerns in Washington that the site could eventually serve dual civilian and military purposes. China has also expanded its military relationships throughout the region by selling aircraft, radar systems, armored vehicles, and small arms to several governments. Training exchanges between Chinese and Latin American security forces have become increasingly common. At least 11 space tracking or satellite ground facilities across Latin America are now linked to Chinese technology networks. Step back and look at the broader pattern, and it becomes impossible to dismiss. China is building influence not just economically, but strategically. Which brings us back to Washington's current strategy. Under President Trump's second term, the United States government has shifted its attention back toward the Western Hemisphere. The National Security Strategy released in November 2025 placed the region among America's highest strategic priorities. The document contained a striking admission. It stated that allowing foreign competitors from outside the Western Hemisphere to gain influence in the region may have been one of the greatest strategic mistakes made by the United States in recent decades. Washington now appears determined to correct that mistake. On March 7th this year, the United States hosted the first Shield of the Americas Summit in Miami, Florida. Leaders from 12 Latin American countries gathered alongside American officials to discuss regional security cooperation. During the summit, President Trump announced the creation of a new security alliance designed to protect what he described as the freedom, security, and prosperity of the Western Hemisphere. Representatives from Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guyana, Honduras, Panama, Paraguay, and Trinidad and Tobago participated in the meeting. At the same time, Trump introduced a new strategic doctrine. He called it the Monroe Doctrine. The name combines Donald with the Monroe Doctrine, the historic United States policy first declared in 1823 that warned European powers against interfering in the Americas. Trump's updated version carries a similar message for the 21st century. Hostile foreign powers will not be allowed to establish strategic footholds in the Western Hemisphere. While the announcement did not directly mention Beijing, the implication was obvious. Recent developments reinforce that message. The government of Panama recently moved to take control of 2 ports along the Panama Canal that had previously been operated by a company owned by Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing. The decision was widely interpreted as an attempt to limit Chinese influence over one of the world's most critical shipping routes. Earlier this year, a joint operation involving the United States Drug Enforcement Administration and American military forces captured Nicolas Maduro in Caracas, delivering a major blow to China's oil partnerships in the region. Washington has also imposed travel bans on several Chilean officials suspected of cooperating with Chinese projects involving undersea communication cables. At the same time, American officials warned Peru against transferring full control of a massive Chinese-built port facility. These actions reveal a clear pattern. From Venezuela to Panama, from Chile to Cuba, the United States is reasserting influence across its traditional sphere. Some analysts believe that once the geopolitical situation involving Iran stabilizes, Washington may focus its full attention on Cuba, not through invasion, but through political pressure, economic leverage, and diplomatic realignment. Chinese affairs expert Yu Zhishan recently suggested that the sequence of events unfolding across Venezuela, Iran, Panama, Chile, and Cuba may represent part of a broader campaign designed to strategically encircle the Chinese Communist Party. Adam Scott Bellows, founder of the Israeli Innovation Fund, wrote in the Jerusalem Post that President Trump's ultimate objective may be the collapse of the CCP-backed geopolitical network that includes Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. Whether that prediction proves correct remains uncertain. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Cuba is no longer just a small Caribbean island struggling with blackouts and economic hardship. It has become a strategic chess piece in a growing global confrontation. And the next move on that chessboard could reshape the balance of power across the entire Western Hemisphere. If you found this analysis valuable, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the world is entering a new Cold War between the United States and China? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep analysis of the geopolitical forces shaping our world today.